Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Marketing Live for Thursday, December 21st, 2017, the final Higher Ed Live episode of 2017. I'm Rob Zinkin. I serve as Associate Vice President for Marketing at Indiana University. Hope you have had a fantastic fall semester and wish you and your families a wonderful holiday season and hopefully some rest and relaxation as you prepare for 2018. The new year will bring change for our institutions, I'm sure, in some way, shape, or form. And today we'll talk about selling that change. And as marketing and communications leaders, we're typically the ones taking the lead on communicating that change. And we've got an excellent case study today to share with you on change management from Augsburg University. But first, a reminder that Marketing Live is part of the Higher Ed Live network. Our episodes offer you direct access to the best and brightest minds in education and beyond. Be a part of our live broadcast with your comments and your questions. You can participate in today's discussion by tweeting us using the Higher Ed Live hashtag. All of our episodes are free and easy to access in the video archives at higheredlive.com, or take Higher Ed Live with you on the go by subscribing to the podcast. I just listened earlier in the week to an episode of Advancement Live from earlier in the year on activating alumni as social media ambassadors, and it made my evening run go by really quickly. So there's just so much great content on the podcast archive. So encourage you to check out some previous episodes. Higher Ed Live is produced by M. Stoner, a digital-first agency committed to tailored solutions that drive real results. Are you a newsletter subscriber? By signing up for the Higher Ed Live newsletter, you get exclusive details about offers from our partners, access to research before it's released, myth-busting admissions being the latest example, and additional professional development opportunities, as well as VIP invitations to events and tons of freebies and giveaways from conference passes all the way to gift cards. This holiday season, in fact, one lucky subscriber will receive the gift of digital storytelling. We're giving away access to M. Stoner's Digital Storytelling for Higher Education course, where you will learn the essential elements of on-brand digital storytelling to engage your most important audiences. Subscribe to the newsletter, and you can enter the drawing by subscribing, and we'll tweet out information to that in just a bit. So thanks as well to our friends at Funnelback. If you're analyzing web traffic, you know that 30% of your visitors likely navigate using search. Funnelback for Higher Education makes search on your website a profitable marketing asset. This flexible, pre-assembled search solution includes sophisticated marketing analytics and accessibility tools out of the box. Details at funnelback.com/HE. That's funnelback.com/HE, short for higher ed. So let's talk selling institutional change, and I'm excited to welcome our guests, Rebecca John and Stephen Jędrzejczyk from Augsburg University. Rebecca is Vice President of Marketing and Communications there, where she has served since 2010, and she brings a deep and diverse background, having previously held executive and marketing leadership positions in both private and public companies, and her role at Augsburg is quite broad, and we'll touch on that in just a bit. Stephen Jędrzejczyk is Director of Marketing at Augsburg University, and he's been there since 2015. Prior to that, he was just up the road from me working in marketing and communications at his alma mater, Ball State University. So nice seeing you both, and thanks so much for making time for this right before the holidays.
Thanks, Rob.
Absolutely. Glad to be here.
And I know we have a lot to cover, but I first want to give listeners an opportunity to learn a bit more about each of you. So I'll ask if you could share something from your professional journey, whether that's a specific experience, a mentor, or any other significant influence that has had a lasting impact on you and your career path. So Rebecca, let's start with you.
A couple years after I graduated from college, I applied to the Peace Corps. And in doing so, I had to turn in my SAT scores, and somehow I missed this in high school. But my quantitative reasoning was off the charts, and so I'm in the wrong field. I got a degree in journalism. But I think that moment, taking my ability to communicate into another culture and into a quantitative world, and then just navigating that was transformational. And as marketing becomes much more about analytics, blending those two sides of the brain has become really important.
Indeed, that's a hard one to top, Stephen. So any noteworthy influences as part of your professional story?
Yeah, well, one thing I think about fairly regularly is that when I've been in higher ed marketing for more than 10 years now, and when I was interviewing for my first role in higher ed at Ball State, it's a part of our world and our work now, just 10 years later, which I think I use mostly to remind me that it's important to apply the wisdom and the things we've learned as marketers to each new thing that comes along, and not treat each new thing that comes along as if it requires a whole new playbook, each new tactic. So.
Great. And Rebecca, one of the items that has always struck me about your role is this overall leadership that you provide across the institution and beyond just serving on the president senior team. So you chair the Augsburg Campus Master Plan Task Force, the university's Campus Design Committee, the Campus Space and Use Development Committee. And I think those are great examples of how marketing leadership should be leadership outside of our functional area, and how we can be driving the discussion on strategic areas for our institution. So how did that element of your portfolio evolve? And for any marketing colleagues listening who are looking to expand their sphere of influence across their campus, any advice for them?
Yeah, this team and probably many others in our field do a really good job with environmental branding, right? And so I think what happened here at Augsburg University is over time we showed how we were able to really bring physically manifest the personality. We would say brand, right? Marketers would, but when we're talking to other people, we just say an Augie personality, and make that physically without making everything maroon. Right, everyone's afraid you're just gonna, paint everything the school color, and they don't want to let you in. But once they see that you can create a physical experience, and not just environmental branding, but staging and all that kind of thing, then they begin to think, oh, we have a question on. We happen to be building a big building here. We have a question on whether we keep the color palette all the way through the corridor, or we put a pop of blue at the end. And there was a big quandary about that. From a design standpoint, a really easy question for us to answer. So over time, we got larger and larger roles, and pretty soon created a committee for design that I chair. And then I actually didn't necessarily want to be put in charge of all the space decisions because of the drama and emotion that goes with that. But project management carries you pretty far. I would say anybody who has web usability experience, don't underestimate how that can translate into physical decision making, because you're used to thinking about how people will actually use a thing and not your own preference or your own supposition, and it helps a lot. So those things I think could build from a marketing space into a campus experience quite well.
Well, I love the mention of experience, because in higher ed, that's one of the challenges as marketers is we don't necessarily manage all those touch points that make up a big and broad experience. So looking for ways that we can influence the experience, because obviously that's what eventually drives the brand.
Yes.
So it was great seeing both of you recently last month at the AMA Symposium for the Marketing of Higher Education. So since that is fresh in our minds, I'll ask if either of you had any major takeaways from the conference, or if there's anything that you were left pondering from your time in Atlanta. Stephen, I'll ask you to start.
I'm really glad they kept the hot breakfast this year. That was a good decision. No, I've been going to the symposium every year for, I can't remember how many, but it's many years in a row. And what I took away this year was I brought a new assistant director who's reporting to me along, and it was her first time attending. And so seeing the value of the conference from the point of view of a first time attendee, just how great it is to hear from colleagues around the country, around the world, who are facing the same challenges, what kinds of solutions they've come up with, what they've learned through their experience, the opportunity just to even chat about shared challenges. It was really great to see that through the point of view of a first-time attendee.
And Rebecca, you're going to help in planning all of this for next year, right?
Right. And so, there's so many things, but I'll just, zoom in on one thing that Jamie Kaseup from Google said. And one of his points was, don't ask students what they want to be, ask them what problem they want to solve, and which is really good advice. But I also was thinking, and it was fun to have multiple people from our institution there so we could talk about it later. Marketers do that. People come to us with solutions. I want a billboard, I want a website, we need to make a statement. And we always back them up. Who's the audience? What do they know? What do you want them to know? And that's the problem. We kind of get at the problem. So I'm wondering whether having had to do that in our work for all this time, we might not be helpful in our institutions as we move into a world where that is the future of work for our students and graduates.
That's funny. I think you just gave me an idea for a future episode. I should just do higher ed billboards. I think we could talk about that for
somebody asked
for a full hour.
A serious question about billboards the other day. I won't get into it, but I literally looked at her and said, "Are you punking me?" Because it's just like a thing here. Don't bring up billboards.
Well, let's set the stage here. I know 2017 has been a huge year for both of you, and Augsburg College with the name change to Augsburg University, and much more than a name change. And I know it's not often that we have an opportunity to be part of such a significant change for an institution. So could you give us some background on what all this entailed, why it happened, and the story around this significant change for the institution?
Yeah, so my time at Augsburg pretty much lines up with the internal conversation about whether to make this transition or not, and then how to go through with it. So I'll take a swing at starting that. I think 3 years ago, Augsburg already was a university that was still calling itself a college. And for us in our situation, the tensions that introduced, that calling yourself one thing but being another, just became untenable. So a few examples of that. Augsburg has offered graduate degrees for 30 years. In our market, we were the only institution that called ourselves a college that did that. We were trying to increase our ability to recruit international students. And of course, many schools know that the name college can be a challenge in international markets. We had staff members who, when they were describing their role to colleagues around the country, would say, "Oh, I work at a university in the Twin Cities," because that was more accurate to what their experience and their work was. So I think a lot of the change came from trying to resolve those tensions.
And Rebecca, you want to jump in on any additional context?
Yeah, well, the process took 3 years because we spent, and this wasn't marketing driven, this first part, we spent a couple of years having a lot of internal conversations. And we were just looking at a slide earlier today of the verbatims that we'd put up in front of the board, of pro and con for it. And I remember that day because, what happened was intellectually, logically, we all understood that university fit us better. And we were being honest with ourselves that college, we had a emotional and nostalgic affinity to it. And it was at that point that the board said, "Okay, thank you. Now we need to know what the market thinks." And so that's where our group kicked into gear and did the market research, and then built a new brand standards based on that, and the messaging based on that, and then just the part where you have to swap everything out over the course of several months, that enormous project. So we kicked in after the energy had already been built up to make the decision, and I think that worked. It took multiple years, but instead of having to bring everybody along, they were brought along before we actually started the work.
And I'm sure as part of that process, there were challenges along the way. So what were some of those major challenges that you faced? How did you deal with them? And were they all ones that you had anticipated, or anything that was unexpected that came along?
Well, our big fear, and we said this at AMA, because we'd all heard the presentation from Jason Simon at University of California System some years back, right? With the new brand rollout, and then the change.org petition, and the whole resistance. And Stephen and I looked at each other as we were starting this project and said, let's don't have to do what Jason had to do. Right? How do we get so resistance, right? We were worried about resistance. And one of the things, we did multiple things, but one of the things we did, in particular with the messaging, was what we called cut them in on the deal. And that's actually a phrase that comes out of grassroots organizing. And so if you give somebody a role instead of just information, they switch a little bit in their brain from critical thinking to learning. And so the resistance can go down. And, I think about at AMA, that last work session, that workshop about storytelling. So we all know that active learning is stronger than passive learning. And so there's that, right? We were doing stuff. But also don't underestimate what else happens when you get people active is their agency goes up, right? They're owning something. And there's lots of research about how valuable people think when they make even something like a stupid, ugly origami folding thing, and they do a bad job and they still think it's beautiful and worth a lot of money if they've made it. And so in our messaging, instead of saying, all right, well, everybody knows universities have graduate programs, so that's part of the message. And everybody thinks universities are diverse, so that's part of the message. We gave them instructions. So when people say, oh, you're a university, does that mean you have grad programs? Your job is to reaffirm that and add that knowledge to their brain. When they say, oh, why did you change to a university? We say, well, universities are diverse and so is Augsburg. So your job is to reconfirm something they already know and connect that with the university name. And we actually put like what we call stage directions on the bottom of the sheet with the messaging, so that we said down there on the bottom, that's your background. That's your role. And we watched people think about themselves delivering these messages instead of thinking about whether they liked the messages. So that's one way that we worked on that, avoiding the resistance.
And one of the things, I know we have so many different stakeholder groups that we have to serve in higher ed. So what was the thinking, and how did you approach prioritizing those different groups, and in terms of the communications approach, in terms of the outreach? And I'd love to learn more about some of the active roles in terms of how you meaningfully engage these groups in this overall process.
Well, we started with the closer ones in, right? The people on campus, the faculty, the staff, and the students. And we've kind of talked about how we've brought them in. And then as we started to move to the next rings out, I'll let Stephen talk about, the thought process as we maybe doing that video that was going to be among the first time some of the broader alumni heard about it.
Yeah, so the folks who were super close inside, faculty and staff, current students, they have been hearing about this for a long time. Certainly major donors had been hearing from their gift officers, those kind of things. They weren't surprised. But that video really was and the email that it was contained in for a lot of alums was probably the first time they were being exposed to this idea of changing our name at all. And so, you had made a comment earlier, Rob, that the video felt very personal and not as institutional as you might expect. And I think in part it's because we were thinking of it primarily for those insiders. And I'm not sure that alumni, for example, really want an institutional feel. I think they probably want something that feels more authentic and personal. And so our institutional advancement folks were the ones who funded creating the video. And our VP came to me and said, and Stephen, I think you should be the narrator. You should be the voice of this video. And I said, thanks for the funding for the video. I think that part is a terrible idea because I had been here for 18 months or so at that point. I'm not an Augsburg alum. Who the heck am I for all these alums, right? So this is, speaking of the storytelling, one of the elements of storytelling is who are the characters. And we were very intentional about deciding who the characters were we were going to put in front of this alumni audience. We chose a very popular theater professor and our athletic director, both of whom are alums and have a long history at the institution. We said we were using them to introduce the video because they're the co-chairs of our upcoming sesquicentennial. I'd urge you not to think too hard about that because it makes no sense. That was just our excuse for putting those two faces in front of the alumni. And we had them introduce a third character, Samuel Gross, who's an alum of the institution and is the designer who we retained to do the logo work. So this, I think, made it much harder for people to push off on either the name change itself. It was implicitly being endorsed by these beloved faculty and staff people, or disagree with what Sam thinks the character of Augsburg is. Because he's an alum, you can't say he doesn't have a valid point of view on it. So that was the thinking behind that.
Yeah, I thought that was a really smart approach on the video, and we'll be sure to tweet out a link to that so that listeners and viewers can take a look at it as well. So that's again the part that makes this overall approach really unique is the use of storytelling. And if you could break that down further in terms of the role of storytelling beyond the video even, and what were some other specific examples where you use storytelling to communicate key points or key updates or other key elements of this change for Augsburg?
Yeah, I think another really good example of that was our work on the seal for the university. So like a lot of things, it was obviously going to have to change. It had Augsburg College in it. And this is kind of a visual story, so I'll do my best to, in a podcast audio kind of environment, to still paint this picture. But we were looking at the seal and realized that just changing the name wasn't going to be enough. There were other issues that our office had long encountered in the design. There's a shape on one side that is supposed to be a lion representing our Norwegian heritage, but it really looked more like an animal cracker. There was a shape on the other side that was supposed to be an eagle representing American democracy. It looked more like a dove. There was a whole shape at the bottom that's supposed to be the lamp of knowledge, but the handle is offset. So it ends up looking more like potentially a sunrise, potentially a communion wafer. So we wanted to try to correct some of these issues, although we also needed the history, right? We went back to the university archivist because if that animal cracker had been hand drawn by our second president, maybe we shouldn't change it. It turned out that wasn't the case. Actually, it was really instructive. She was able to show us where the seal design had come from. It was created for our centennial back in the 1960s by an alum. And the original design didn't have any of these issues. It was much clearer. It had some really interesting typographic choices that had been changed along the years. And so we decided for the work on the seal to go back to that original piece and make that the inspiration for what the university's new seal would be. So what we would do is basically tell that story I just told you to audiences, because people would get so wrapped up in the story and I guess the drama, such as it is, it's not that high stakes, obviously, but they would be thinking about that so much that they weren't thinking anymore about the name change at all. So the role of the story in that case is that when people focus in and engage on the story, they are doing that instead of being critical of whether they're happy or not about the decision being made.
We did it also with the logo, and I'll let Stephen go into detail. But you know, when you do this with graphic design all the time. So we started with the story. So our research shows that Augsburg College or University is known for strong academics, high impact, and dynamism and energy. And so we put that out there first, and everyone's like, yeah, that's us, that we really like that. And then instead of, here's the logo, do you like it or you don't, we unveiled the logo and showed them different ways that the new design manifested those things that they just bought into in the story of the institution.
Yeah, it was effectively a lot like the creative brief process that we would use with a partner on campus being applied to a much larger audience. So, you know, people invest a lot of emotion and value in a logo, but it's not actually the design of the logo, it's what the logo stands for that they're investing that energy and that emotion in. And so the process we went through, as Rebecca described, was describing basically the creative brief we gave the designer. Here's what we think the new logo needs to say about Augsburg, and then showing them the new logo and asserting how it met all those objectives. And that seemed to be very effective.
And just a reminder, if you have questions or comments for Rebecca or Stephen, or just want to share your perspective, please join us in the discussion and tweet using the Higher Ed Live hashtag. I also am curious about the source of this strategy, if this came from your previous experiences, or if you've seen a more traditional top-down approach perhaps fail elsewhere, or how exactly did you see the light?
You know, in putting together the presentation, I'm not directly answering your question. I'm laughing because in putting together the presentation, we kind of started with, well, that worked. How did we pull that off? So we actually had to figure out, I mean, there was a lot of thinking, but I'm not sure how prescient we actually were. As much as once it worked, we realized why it worked. I don't mean to sell us short. Stephen, do you have a different thought?
No, I think that's true. I mean, that's part of why we wanted to give the presentation at AMA, was to be reflective on the experience and unpack why this had gone so well, because there were a lot of decisions that we made intentionally and they worked the way we thought they were going to work. But there were also decisions we made that we were really just either going on instinct, or frankly, in some cases, we just plain got lucky. And so we wanted to unpack that. I think part of what we learned in it is that selling change like that is almost by definition mostly about audiences that are very close to you. Because if they aren't close to you, then the change doesn't even register as a change to them, right? So the video is a great example of that, right? The video we used to roll out the logo was very intentionally structured so that people who loved this place could see what they loved about this place in it. We weren't telling them what this place is, and that might or might not align with what their actual experience had been. As opposed to, we do have another video that is about introducing Augsburg University, but that one is really only used in advertising for prospective students. Folks who don't already have an impression of who we are. There we want to make a big emotional impact and tell them, here's what's distinctive about this place, why you should consider coming here. But I think you need a very different approach for those two kinds of audiences.
Yeah, I think, maybe we paid some attention in advance to one of the things we know about change management for a lot of things is you have to make sure, even in a real positive change. So we're opening a whole new building January 8th. And we're moving out of an outdated old science building. And the advice I keep getting from people on campuses who have done this is make sure you make space for the letting go of the old building. The old building that the science faculty and the science students can't wait to move out of, where they couldn't plug in 2 toasters without tripping the electrical system, right? And yet there's going to be nostalgia. And so, if you listen to what Stephen was just saying, we gave people room to find what they loved, even as we were introducing the change. So they had that thing to hold fast to. One of the things that helped us with that, it was a finding from the research that we hadn't necessarily predicted, but so what we found from research with people who are not in our student base, who are not in our prospective base, but in our demographics. So they hadn't done any research on Augsburg. They actually had a very high opinion of Augsburg, and that brand equity accrued to the word Augsburg and not to the name college or university. So that was helpful to us when thinking about them. But when we come back inside the institution, the first thing we got to tell people was, people out there, people who don't even know us that well, people really like Augsburg. There's a strong positive feeling for Augsburg. Anybody here, their pride goes up, right? And so now we're talking about that saying, so what we know about the new logo, for example, what we know about the new logo is it has to preserve that strong Augsburg. And if you are able to show the logo in some of the follow-on materials, the word Augsburg is much bolder and stronger and in the front, and university is scaled back. And so I think maybe one of the influences that were undercut some of this was us paying attention to not making anyone feel like they had to wipe away something they cared about and replace it with something they didn't know yet.
Yeah, I think another thing that certainly struck me, is not surprising, but in the focus groups, when folks were first introduced to the idea that there is no body, there is no standard, there's not some entity that has to say, yes, you were a college, but now you're a university. There's no definition. Probably close to half of participants, their reaction to that information was to try to create their own definition, right? They tried to, oh, well, then I think it must be schools that are at least 2,000 students and have a campus at least 58 or whatever. And so when there's a gap, people just rush to fill it in. And the same thing in the opposite direction, I think, would happen when we were presenting, certainly about the logistics of the name change, about how we were going to go about replacing signs and campus wayfinding and gym floor and athletic field graphics and all this kind of stuff. Was once they saw that there was someone who was thinking about this, if it was being confidently and competently handled, their anxiety level went way down, right? Oh, I don't have to worry about this. Someone's got the ball. That was really interesting to me.
So you both referenced the market research work that was done. So could you dive into that a little bit more deeply? What form did that take? How long? Who all were the audiences that you involved in the process? Because that's such a critical part of any discipline process. And I do want to highlight the role that it played in your work.
Yeah, so we hired an external firm called Hilkers and Warner. And we had worked with Warner before on messaging work in some of our programs like the MBA. And Hilgers had just recently done a massive study for the University of Minnesota, Twin Cities, as they were looking at renaming things and just using the M, literally the letter sweater M. And what does that M stand for? What do people think it means? And so we brought those two people in, and we did these focus groups. We did 5 of them, or 5 audiences. And prospective student groups, and again, when I say prospective, it's not somebody who's inquired. We did not want somebody who's already bought into Augsburg. We thought that would bias it. So people that fit the demographic, so high school students coming into college but not yet inquired to Augsburg. People with that didn't finish their bachelor's at the traditional age but were interested in doing so, but not in our inquiry pool. People with a bachelor's but not a master's and wanting to go back and get a graduate degree, but not in our inquiry pool. And then parents of that first group, and then high school counselors. And of course, the high school counselors understood us best. And it was qualitative research, right? So what do you think about Augsburg? What do you think about Augsburg College? What do you think about Augsburg University? I mean, an hour of this kind of stuff, and then pulling through all of that research. They did a deep dive and came up with, oh, and then by the way, they also interviewed, the Hilkers and Warner also interviewed our leadership internally. And so there's a Venn diagram we showed during our presentation, which is, here's what the leadership team said that your market didn't say. Here's what you both said. And then here's what the market said that you didn't say. Those are always going to be the three categories, because the fourth category is something nobody said, and that's all the rest of the words. So you've got stuff you care about, but the market didn't say, and that stuff you need to figure out how to add into the conversation. You've got stuff you both said, and that's the stuff you need to double down on and use and reference, right? And use that almost as the first part of this. Since we're diverse, therefore, right? Because everybody already believes it. And the third thing is either good stuff people think about you that you want to pull in, or negative stuff. In our case, we found that the biggest negative thing was that universities are seen as big and bureaucratic, and we didn't want that. And so we know that in all of our communication, we have to counter that instinct on the part of the market and replace it with something else. And in our case, we have a phrase: Augsburg's a new kind of university. It's small to our students, but it's big for the world. And so we gave everybody that line. And so that is the underlying messaging that came out of, I don't know how many hours of conversation, just to pull some threads through. And you really need to, I'm not giving anybody advice they don't know here, but your hiring of who you're going to have to do the research, because that interpretation is so much of an art to pull all those different comments into something that's useful.
We also did much later in the process some brand benchmark work, wanting to gauge things like unaided awareness, brand attributes, all those kind of things, so that we can do that same study again in, say, 2 or 3 years, and we can see what impact both the name change and our advertising and marketing around the name change have on those things.
Right, because our supposition is, because the name is changing, people are paying attention in a way that they wouldn't have if there was no name change. And so we're wondering if in that moment of curiosity and openness, as we put messages in, do they stick? And so the longitudinal research will help us gauge how successful we were at that.
Great. We also have a question via Twitter. Thanks for the question from Will. Did you have separate strategies in communications just for internal audiences, or were they inclusive of the entire community? Who wants to take that one?
I'll start, because I used to be in corporate before I came to higher ed. And in corporate, you had internal messaging and external messaging. And in higher ed, that's not possible, right? You do an email to the faculty and staff, and it could be in the newspaper tomorrow. So we don't do any communication, including this one, where the messaging wouldn't also play. Well, we'd be fine if it went externally. It doesn't mean we treat everybody the same, but I think Stephen already said it. We focused on what was going to work with the people who already loved this place, and then made sure that if that then went out farther, we were fine with it. So the thing that changed most, I would say, was the channels. Right? We had a lot of meetings internally. Here's a new logo. Here's why. Here's the whole process of the swap that Stephen mentioned. He and the project manager on that, I don't know how many meetings you held, just explaining, here's the process, here's what's going to happen with letterhead, here's the database of 1,000 things, go read it, and if you find something not on the list, put it on the list, but if you're worried about it, go check the list. And there were thousands of things on there, so most of the time they found it, right? So we spent a lot more time and a lot more in-person time with internal audiences, and then we had broadcast channels for the external ones, but same messaging.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the biggest difference, I think, probably between the two, and again, as Rebecca said, it wouldn't have been a problem at all if the information had gone beyond internal, but the big thing internal audiences had, they were concerned about, that no one outside was concerned about, was the logistics, was how is this going to happen? How are you going to pull this off? And so that's what that series of 12, it was about 12 meetings, probably information sessions that my colleagues and I held. That was the main purpose of those, was to help people let go of that anxiety.
Mm-hmm.
And in terms of knowing that you did a good job, or that this has been well received, I suppose perhaps one measure is a lack of resistance, and anecdotal and other ways of seeing people buying in. But did you have specific measures of success that you were monitoring as you undertook this process and went forward?
The president, I'm just going to give the goal. The president said, I want this to be a celebration, not, he didn't say funeral, but I wanted to be a happy celebration day when we switch. So we were watching for that. And Stephen, maybe that's what you were going to talk about. I don't know.
No, yeah, that's a great example. I think another indicator was by the time our formal governing bodies actually made the change to our bylaws, our challenge actually flipped, and we had many people who were so eager then for the change, which wasn't official for another 6 months, to allow us time for all that swapping we needed to do, right? And to prepare for that celebration. But they were so eager. They like, oh, can I get a new business card today? Can we update the website today? And no, the answer was no. Our president actually was among those who was, of course, very excited, because this is a change he's been advocating for some time. And on the first day, September 1st, that it was official, he went out in front of his house, which the university owns, and he raised a new Augsburg University flag himself that morning. So.
And then reported back to us that he had waited.
Right, that he had waited.
So in terms of tracking, I think the actual answer to your question, Rob, is we knew that we wanted excitement, and because we were having to kind of hold people back, we knew it was building. I think that if it had felt different, we would have had different conversations, like, this is, it's falling flat, or we're getting resistance, and we would have had to do other things. But since we knew we were basically, the demand was being pent up, right, on purpose. So that on September 1st, it could be a big splash. In fact, we had an opportunity to tell that story a couple of days before the official launch. I can't remember what the exact scenario was. And it might have even been a media story or something. And we said, no, we don't want it one day early, because then the party's going to be an afterthought. And so we really were very disciplined about keeping everything on to September 1st.
Another indicator for me was that, in social media, there was some crabbiness about the name change itself, although it was a really low percentage of the responses that we got. But for the logo design itself, there was no negative pushback. There was one example. Someone posted a photo of a monument sign installed at one of our remote sites, and the person complained, that logo looks awful. But they were right. The logo had been incorrectly manufactured. There was actually an issue with the installation. And so the fact that was the only negative feedback we got on the creative work, I saw as a definite win.
Yeah, they actually helped us, because we wouldn't have known about it for a couple of days. We were able to correct it. Yeah, the most negative comment was something like, oh, it's always going to be Augsburg College to me. And we recognize that right away, as that's a familiarity thing, right? People don't predict how much they're going to be able to change. And that's actually true of logos too. People think that the logo has to pop, or they have to love it or something. And actually what we love about a logo is how well it wears over time, and what it means to us, because it's familiar, right? I don't like the Starbucks logo, but boy, when I need coffee and I see that green circle, I'm so happy, right? And it isn't because of the love of the aesthetics. It's because, I'm going to get caffeine. and so you launch a new logo, and people are looking at it for the first time and evaluating it for the first time, and their first impression is not relevant, but they don't know that, right? And so it was all about, how much of this can we get people to be willing to give it time, because we know that as familiarity builds, they're going to fall back in love with it.
Yeah, that's awesome. It's all meant to endure. So that's a great point. And among all of these changes, I did fail to mention that your roles and titles also apply to Luther Seminary. And that's the result of an alliance between Augsburg University and Luther Seminary. So I want to ask how that all materialized, and also, are there implications for you both from a marketing standpoint with that alliance?
I'll talk at the larger level, and then Stephen can talk specifically about on the marketing team. So it's a an effort by our two presidents to come up with an innovative way of supporting higher ed in a cost-effective manner. So this doesn't include academic programs, right? So it's about IT and finance, marketing. Marketing only works if you've got institutions that don't compete with each other, right? IT could maybe go across multiple institutions of similar audiences, but marketing couldn't. And what actually happens here is, all right, so all of us have a number of people on our staff, and the size of our staffs is constrained by the scale of our institutions, right? And none of us has as many people as we want. And what ends up happening is somebody in your group, or many people in your group, do multiple roles because you just don't have enough people to do all of them. And the way to get more specialization is to grow the scale of the institution and be able to add more people. But you know how hard it is to grow enrollment in our market today. So what we actually ended up doing by having this alliance is increasing our scale by just having two institutions. And we've actually been able to bring in somebody who can focus on internal communications for both institutions, instead of both institutions having a marketing person try to do that in their free time. So you see how the scale works there. We brought it up in the AMA presentation because that makes people nervous, right? We haven't seen anything like this. It's just going to be a merger. We're just going to merge, and why don't we just, get it over with? And we're not trying to merge. We both have our own boards. We both have our own governance, assets, liabilities, all of it. But we can say that we can say that forever. And nobody's going to believe, this is what the CFO over there says, nobody's going to believe we're not going to merge until we don't, right? And so how do you help people with that change? And what we realize in that case is we have to start building the story. We have to start talking about what we are doing. We have to do some stuff and then report it, and then report it again and report it again. So, in the marketing area, Stephen can talk more directly about what that means for a marketing function covering two institutions.
Right. Yeah, it's along the lines of what you were already saying, though. So a specific example on the marketing team is at Augsburg, we have two graphic designers. Previously, they both managed all of their own competitive bid processes with printers and invoicing and purchase orders and all of that stuff, which is not really what we're paying them to do, right? We're paying them for their creativity and their artistic skill and their ability to convey a message through nonverbal means. Luther had a production manager who handled that work on behalf of the marketing team. And so by bringing her in and having her perform that role for Augsburg as well, that then frees up more of the designer's time to work on design and allow them to absorb the design work that needs to be done for the seminary without adding headcount.
One of the other things that we said was an advantage, we knew it would be an advantage, but it actually, it turns out to be true. By working on two institutions, you think that the problem would be, at least what I'm finding so far, you think the problem would be just being pulled in multiple directions, but it actually, I'm finding it's inspiring more ideas and innovation on the other side because you've taken your brain off of it for a bit. Just a real small example, and this is a good idea that we didn't have. Luther Seminary has a database of photos not to use that over time somebody's discovered, don't picture this person, for whatever reason. And we have some of those, and we know them anecdotally, but now we've built our own database. So these are the photos we can't use anymore. Just small stuff like that improves both of our operations.
Well, in thinking through everything that you've been through and the leadership you've provided, I was thinking of anything comparable from my experience, and the closest has been at one of our Indiana University regional campuses and sharing a process to change nickname and mascot, and like you, that was something that you don't get to do every day in your career, having those opportunities to make significant change at an institution and provide leadership for that change. So as you reflect on this experience, are there any learnings that you've had personally that you'll carry forward and apply in the future in terms of leading change, selling change, and it doesn't even have to be for things this big, but even smaller day-to-day things? What will you carry forward from this process?
Stephen, are you waiting for me?
I was, yes.
Okay, I can go. Well, one of the things that this happened as we were preparing the presentation, in any change, you're in this moment where you're worried, right? You're asking yourself, how are we going to convince these people, whatever? How are we going to get this buy-in? And what I've learned from this process is you got to get off that question. You got to go away from that question and replace it with something else. And so some of the ones that we had happened to use in this case, and I keep them, right? Who should tell this story? How can this be fun? What role can they have? What story do we need to build? I'm actually finding that one, what are we doing, being a really important one in the communication side of the world these days, where something happens in the world and somebody or some students say, we need to make a public statement. Net neutrality, we need to make a public statement. And if you can turn it back to first say, well, tell me what you're doing, right? Because a public statement is really easy to do if you're reporting out something somebody's doing, not just, hey, we believe. And so replacing how do we convince everybody with what story are we building? What are the objectives that everyone can buy into? And then let's show how this work leads to those. Asking yourself a different question at the beginning of that, okay, we got to go persuade people process, I think is pretty powerful.
Yeah, and I think this is related to that, but just like I think all of us who work with designers and with visual creative work realize that the goal can't be for our campus partners or anyone to like it. It has to be about, does it serve its purpose? The same thing is kind of true for this change management process, which you have to say up front, our goal can't be to make people happy. Our goal can't be to make them like it. So if that is the goal, you're doomed to fail. You need to find another goal to pursue.
Well, anything that we missed, we didn't cover, or any final takeaways or advice, pieces of recommendation that you would pass along to marketing colleagues? In fact, you can have the very last word of 2017 for Higher Ed Live. So I'll put it out there, Rebecca, if you'd like it, or Stephen, if you'd like it.
I have one thing that happened in the process that we didn't use in the presentation. We all know how important it is to listen, right? And so I'll just give a little story about what happened. We were doing all these meetings, explaining the objectives of the logo and then rolling out the logo. And our new logo our old logo had like an equal weight between the word Augsburg and the word college. And the new one, they were different weights, different fonts, not centered, right? And I was explaining how that brought energy and tension. And Augsburg is a place where we lean into tensions and all that stuff. And it was a languages professor who said, oh, because of the two fonts, that's what makes the logo dynamic. A word I hadn't been using, but a really good word. And so because I was presenting, but also listening at the time, I said, yes, dynamism. That's exactly what our logo was built to convey. We actually changed our wording a little bit because he gave us this beautiful word and the whole room is nodding. And so pay attention to that moment when somebody says something and everyone else is agreeing. And if that word didn't come out of your mouth, and it's accurate, you might want to pick that up and put that into your story.
Awesome. Again, congratulations to both of you on the outstanding work that you've done at Augsburg University, and really appreciate you giving us an inside look at all that went into it, and best wishes for continued success there.
Thanks, Rob. Have a happy
holiday.
Thanks
so much. Thanks for inviting us. It's been fun.
A lot of fun.
You bet. Happy holidays to you as well. So thanks so much to both Rebecca and Stephen for all of their insights today. As always, thanks to M. Stoner for making Marketing Live possible. Thanks as well to Funnelback for its support of today's episode and sponsorship. Again, be sure to get reminders about this and other episodes by subscribing to the Higher Ed Live newsletter. You can browse the video archives at higheredlive.com or subscribe to the podcast. I'm Rob Zinkin, wishing you the happiest of holiday seasons. Thanks again for tuning into Marketing Live on the Higher Ed Live Network, and we will look forward to seeing you in 2018.